You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to adding life to your years. And now your hosts, registered dietitian Juliana Hever and scientist Ray Cronice.
Welcome.
Hello, hello.
How are you doing, Juliana?
I'm actually pretty good. How are you doing, Raymond James?
I am so excited about today's show.
I know you are. It's
really
pretty
great.
special.
One of my closest friends from college, the person that I got into all the trouble with.
I heard all sorts of war stories.
Yeah. Dr. Peter Diamandis is going to be with us today. And it's going to be a really fun time. It's a part of my life that maybe a lot of people that know me from the health span and the food and the plant-based diet community, they probably don't know this section of my life. I mean, people typically say, oh, he was a NASA scientist, and that's kind of a throwaway. But at the same time, Peter represents a lot of who I am. And so, just to give a little foundation, Peter founded the XPRIZE, the first $10 million prize that for successful suborbital flight. Burt Rutan won that, and this is what spawned Elon Musk to do his SpaceX Falcon series of rockets, and Richard Branson's and Jeff Bezos. All of these things have gone on. He founded Singularity University. He's had over 20 high-tech companies along the way. But he's a Harvard medical doctor, amongst other things. He went to MIT for his undergraduate master's in biomechanical engineering, I believe it was. But unbelievable wide breadth of knowledge. And today, having Peter on, we're going to really talk about his new book, The Future is Faster Than You Think. Well, what did you think of it when we read it in preparing for this?
Oh, I think it's really exciting. I think with all the stuff going on in the world and all the people worried about so many things, there's so much anxiety. It's just obviously, that this is a real beautiful, positive, uplifting, and very exciting ideas to think about. Like this is where we should put our minds right now to kind of think forward and embrace what's happening and make the best of it, because the future is here and things are absolutely unprecedented and it's a whole new world.
Yeah, and this is the third book in what would be really a trilogy. He wrote a book, Abundance and Bold, before this, and they sort of all go together. You don't need to have read those before you read this one, but they all three paint a very different, optimistic, human flourishing picture of the future. And it's so easy to get caught up in a Facebook feed or an Instagram feed or a Twitter feed and see this doom and gloom. And what Peter sort of ingrained in me from, really some of my youngest, most formative age was this idea of being positive and making it happen and going out there and slaying that problem. Find the problem that you really care about solving and just going after it. And I think, we've gotten to do this in the last 3 years. There's been so many, there's going to be problems. So I'm not saying that life is going to be roses and everything's going to work out. We've dealt with crazy people and all kinds of things along the way. But it's not how many times you get knocked down. It's how many times you get back up and make it happen. And yeah, you lose your cool. And yeah, you do things that aren't that great. But I love what we do. This week, so many clients have finished.
We've had such an exciting week. Yes.
I mean, we right before recording this, we get to have this, I'm going to name drop Miss Kendra, one of our clients. She is down 153 pounds in a year. She lost 100 pounds before she came to us. And now we've pushed her over that line. And the enthusiasm in her voice and the determination. And Rachel was just determined. She's succeeding. KNMO, we've just had so many clients that are doing great right now. And
achieving
it just feels good.
And achieving things that they never thought they could.
It's really so not that difficult. And when I look back at some challenges we had a year and a half ago, I mean, they're really bumps. We overinflate the importance of these little setbacks. And Peter, and talking to Peter, I know what I'm going to hear from him today. And hearing it in his voice, it will immediately be like a sort of a snake charmer for me, in my head. He always gets me pumped up. So let's tie Peter in. Peter, welcome. It's great to have you on.
Ray, a pleasure, pal. It's always love my time with you.
Yeah, it's been great. So since our audiences don't really put us together, we've been doing all these crazy things, but we have such a rich past. Why don't you spend just a few minutes? Let's kind of catch them up with sort of, I don't know, it would be Ray 1.0 and Ray 2.0. And then you were also responsible for Ray 3.0 with the 10 years ago with Singularity. Why don't you tell a little bit of your story, how you got to this place, and talk just a little bit about going from Ray and Peter at SEDS all the way forward to where we are.
So I was born in the 60s and passionate about spaceflight because it was the Apollo program. And like I like to joke, that scientific documentary, Star Trek, that really ignited my fire. Wanted to become an astronaut. My parents wanted me to become a doctor. And I ended up spending a decade in school. And it was the early days while I was in MIT, I found out there was no space organization there. And I ended up starting an organization called SED, Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, SEDS. And it was an amazing organization that grew globally. Jeff Bezos was the president of the Princeton chapter. Some guy named Ray Cronise was the president of his chapter. He's from Alabama. And we ended up basically aggregating amazing people from around the world who are passionate about space and working together as undergraduates and graduate students. And from SEDS, from the next organization that I co-founded with two dear friends, Todd Hawley and Bob Richards, was something called the International Space University, ISU. And the idea of International Space University was we wanted to create a place that people who were passionate about space, who were born with the bug that Ray, you and I were both born with, could come to and learn about all the different disciplines, not just astronomy and rocket science, but everything, business, policy, law, architecture, all those things. And we ended up having the first summer in 1988.
Yes.
And it was a high risk venture. No one ever heard of this university. And here were, a few young guys in their 20s hiring faculty and putting a university together. And we had 104 students from 21 countries. I'll have that burned in my memory forever.
Yes, me too.
Who came together on June 21st of 1988 in Cambridge for 8 weeks. And you were one of them. And it was extraordinary. We had students from the People's Republic of China, from the Soviet Union.
When it was the USSR at that time?
It was.
It was before the perestroika, right before the fall, if you remember that.
Yeah, I do. And it was an amazing, amazing summer of just anything was possible. We were dreaming about opening the space frontier and planning what the moon bases were going to be like. And space, you and I met that summer, and we had met before, but we became even closer friends that summer. Mm-hmm. And just, friendships that would last a lifetime. And my dream of space had shifted. I was now in medical school at that point, and I was meeting a bunch of astronauts, as you also knew many, many astronauts. And I was just like, I want desperately to try and go on into space. But the thing that you were doing that I was so jealous of, extraordinarily jealous of, is that you were flying on NASA's KC-135, their zero-G airplane. And this is euphemistically called the vomit comet. We don't call it that. So you tried to get me on. I tried to apply to get on. It's like, can I be a medical guinea pig? You can inject me with anything. Just let me fly on the damn airplane.
Right.
And I couldn't. And so a few years later, I remember I was actually in Huntsville in 1993, May of 1993.
Sitting in a bar with Byron.
Yes.
And a
Yes.
napkin.
Yes. And you. And we were brainstorming, well, if I want to go so bad, I don't want to go so bad. Why don't we start a company to do zero gravity flights? And so the three of us co-founded a company called Zero Gravity Corporation, or Zero G. And this was in May of 1993. And we thought, like every entrepreneur does, it's going to be easy. So we can use, we're not going to use an old KC-135 like NASA uses, like from the 1950s. We're going to use a more modern airplane, maybe a 727 or a 737.
With air stairs.
Yeah, I love that. Gotta love those air stairs. Gotta love those air stairs. And so we end up, I remember we raised $500,000 from a guy named Mike McDowell. And then from Richard Garriott, the son of Owen Garriott, an astronaut and still a dear friend. And we ended up basically beginning to try and get the designs to modify a commercial plane to do zero-G flights. Long story short, it took 11 years, 11 years for us to get FAA approval. And it was an insane journey to get us there. You were key, Byron was key, I was insane. And we finally, in September of 2004, 11 years later, we got approval. I like to joke it was an overnight success after 11 years of hard work. Along the way, you worked with the brothers who created the Matrix to do zero-G flights for special effects on the Matrix. Afterwards, we flew Stephen Hawking on that zero-G flight, which was amazing. And everybody today, if you haven't yet, you can go and fly on a zero-G airplane. You just go to the website, gozerog.com, GOZEROG.com, and it's $5,000, which is still quite the steal.
Yep.
And it's amazing. And I've probably flown 100 flights, 150 flights, something on that order. And Ray, why don't you tell everybody how many flights on the order of magnitude you've flown?
So I flew for 12 years, but we would do between 60 and 100 parabolas. And the parabola is this big roller coaster move, and you get 0 over the top and 1.8 on either side when you're pulling out. So we would do so many more. And so we were really logging parabolas. And at the time, I had 5,000 parabolas or something. So I had over 2 days of my life in weightless. At that time, I've only flown 3 times on our plane, which is still kind of crazy to me. When I was talking to our CEO the other day, and I just couldn't believe that just life happened this way. But another big point.
But you've flown hundreds of flights.
Oh yeah, dozens. Yeah. So it was really a lot of fun. And what I used to always say, and this is what charged Peter and Byron and I, is more people do science to fly, which you heard Peter talking about, than fly to do science. And when I was there with another guy, Don Pettit, who's without a doubt, I believe, one of the smartest astronauts that's ever flown. But he and I would do all these really geeky, cool fluid dynamic things. It was really a lot of fun. We were doing fun, incredible science, published 20 or 30 papers on those subjects. But along the way, the other big transformation, this is just one of many transformative ideas we'll talk about today that Peter is at the crux of. But I'll say 2 things. First, everybody laughed at us when we were wanting to do zero-G. They just didn't really take us seriously. And that turned out to be an advantage, because the more they look and the more serious they take, the more artificial hoops they often give you to jump through. And a lot of times we'd go to them and they'd say, "You're not sure. You just go off and do something." And we'd say, "Sure." And they just thought the crazy guys would walk away and they would be done with us. And it turned out that confidence and nonsense and that persistence was one way that we got these things done. And, in the middle of this time, another moment after the 1993 bar moment is in 1995 under the St. Louis Arch. And you had another major thing that unfortunately NASA forbid me to be a part of at that time.
I know.
Or I would have been right there on that one too. But tell everybody about that one.
Yeah. So around the same time, 1993, that zero-G was born cognitively. A few months later, I was given a book by another dear brother, like Ray is to me, Greg Marinac. He gave me a copy of The Spirit of St. Louis. which was a book about Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic. And it chronicled the idea that Lindbergh flew from New York to Le Bourget, not on a whim, but to win a $25,000 prize. I'm like, that's amazing. I'm going to create a prize for private spaceflight to build the rockets that would get me and my friends into space. Because I had given up on the notion that I was going to go up as a NASA astronaut. I had done the math here. My chance of being a NASA astronaut was like 1 in 1,000. At 5'4", I had a better chance of becoming an NBA All-Star than I did a NASA astronaut. And you know how lousy I play basketball. And then what you taught me this, like half the astronauts in the astronaut corps who were selected had never flown, right? They were called penguins because they had wings, but they didn't fly.
Right.
And then even if you did fly, you got to fly maybe on the average twice in your career. And I'm like, I want to fly like twice in a weekend, let alone twice in my career. And so how do you do this thing privately? So on May 18th of 1996, under the Arch of St. Louis, as you said, we announced a $10 million XPRIZE competition for the first team who could build a private spaceship, carry 3 adults, go into space, land safely, and within 2 weeks, make the trip again. And that prize got launched in May of 96. An amazing family, the Ansari family, funded the prize about 5 years later, and it was won in October of 2004, October 4th, 2004. You know what the insane thing? You know what the most insane thing is? That Zero G was launched in May of 1993, right? XPRIZE was launched
May of 96.
Well, I read the book. I read the book in December 93. Right. It was launched in May 96, and then the first Zero G flight was like the 3rd week of September of 2004, and then the XPRIZE flights were 2 weeks later. So these two 11-year projects both came to culmination within like 2 weeks of each other independently. It was insane.
Yeah. And again, everyone laughed at us on the XPRIZE. They were like, why would you put a prize? We have been doing suborbital, just real quick for people listening. The prize was for the suborbital flight. So think of it about as a rocket that goes up and back down. So it's a giant parabola like the Zero G plane. It's just a lot higher and going up. So what was interesting is that from a technological perspective, what everyone was telling Peter and Byron and all of us that were pushing this is, look, this is not big technology. I mean, we've been doing suborbital flights for a long time. Colleges are doing it.
Alan Shepard.
Right. And what we said is, well, wait, this is not a technology prize alone. This is also a regulatory, issue. Who gives you permission to fly Zero G weightless? Who gives you permission to launch something that looks a lot like an intercontinental ballistic missile? We have to deal with these regulatory issues. And one of the things Peter indelibly etched in my brain was this idea that we must create an exothermic economic reaction in space. You, Ray. One that we can give off more economy than we can. And I want everyone to hear this in terms of when we get into talking about longevity, things being really sounding crazy right now. But then when you fast forward and you look back, it looks somewhat obvious. And this will sort of tie into Peter's book as well. But with that little bit of background, this is the root of how Peter and I spent our college years and, all the trips in Europe. And we have all the mutually assured destruction stories that, if we ever anybody wants to blackmail Peter, believe me, I'm your man.
Should we tell a couple of those?
No, I don't think we should tell any of them.
No, yeah. This is a PG-rated show.
But anyway, it was fun. It's not an exaggeration, Peter, when you and I occasionally text each other when Elon's landing yet another rocket vertically.
Falcon 9 first stage,
it's not an exaggeration that people believe this was purely fanatic Star Trek kind of thought. Yeah. And we're living exactly the reality, in fact, more than we really envisioned at that time. And with the title of your new book, the future is coming even faster. So with sort of that segue, let's talk a little bit about those these, this new book, and also like those 7 forces that you believe are sort of redefining how we're going to do this. And we'll be able to end, I hope, on longevity, so that we can talk about what Juliana and I is near and dear our heart, which is how we can really hedge a bet. If diet, we're not going to live forever eating carrots, but what we want to be able to do is hedge our bet and extend that health span long enough so some of these other really transformative technologies fall into place.
Sure, happily. So the book is a look at the convergence of these exponential technologies. So we're living in a time where computational power is getting faster and faster. And everybody probably has heard some version of what Moore's Law. Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, basically said the amount of computational power per dollar is doubling on the average 12 to 18 months in the beginning. Now it's every roughly 24 months. And there's more computational power in your cell phone than was on the planet, back when we went to the moon. And it's insane. I mean, it's massive. You don't think about the fact that the computational power in your cell phone would have been something the KGB and CIA would have killed for 20 years ago.
Right.
It's so on top of all that computational power is riding all these other exponential technologies: AI, robotics, 3D printing, synthetic biology, augmented, virtual reality, blockchain, CRISPR, gene therapy. All these technologies are becoming more and more powerful, faster and faster as computation is getting faster, and they're becoming available to everybody, right? Any one of us could go on Amazon Web Services and spin up 1,000 processor cores. You have access to the world's information. We take for granted the fact you can open up your FaceTime app on your phone and have a beautiful high-resolution video call to someone on the other side of the planet for free. I mean, that was insane science fiction, and we take it for granted right now. And it's just getting more and more. We're making, it's not that a few of us have access to that. These technologies have demonetized, meaning they've made it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and democratized, meaning any place on the planet you can gain access. At the same time, we're about to cover the planet in gigabit connection speeds, right? 5G is deploying globally this year and this decade. And then we've got a whole slew of satellite constellations. OneWeb, that's a friend Greg Weiler is deploying, Starlink that's going up from SpaceX. Apple is reported to be building a constellation, so is Facebook. Anyway, they're doing tens of thousands of satellites. So the Gobi Desert, the top of Mount Everest, will have great gigabit connection speeds.
Wow.
It's insane. And so everyone's being connected. And when you're connected and the price is plummeting, when you're connected, you have access to everything on the cloud for free, AI on the cloud for free. Even quantum computing is available today on the cloud for free. And this will become the means for education and for medical services. Most of these things, AI will become your doctor. AI will become your educator. And so these things are changing the world. So in my book, The Future is Faster Than You Think, that I wrote with a dear friend, Stephen Kotler, he and I have written 3 books together right now. The first part of the book is a recap on, hey, this is what's going on in very layman's terms in these exponential technologies: AI, robotics, 3D printing, quantum computing, brain-computer interface, synthetic biology, which we think of CRISPR and gene therapy, blockchain, energy systems. And then another chapter in the beginning talks about the fact that the speed at which technology is accelerating is itself accelerating, meaning things are getting faster and faster and faster because there's more money than ever before, because there's more brains coming online. Things are becoming cheaper and cheaper, right? I mean, you have been in the biomedical space and tracking gene sequencing. The first gene sequence was a multi-billion-dollar sequence. Then it dropped down to 100 million, and then 1 million. And now the price of sequencing your entire genome is on the order of getting to about $100.
Right.
So it's crazy. So that's the first part of the book. The second part of the book, I look at the future of industries. the health industry, the longevity industry, the finance and insurance industry, entertainment, education, retail, food, and then what's it going to be in the next 10 years? And one of my goals is if people are fearful about what they don't understand, and so I think fear is a terrible place to come from. This, and as we are dealing with this pandemic of fear right now around Corona and COVID-19, it's more than ever. But so in this book, I try and lay out, here's what the decade ahead looks like in these industries. It's really going to make things more available and cheaper for the consumer, uplift our lives in a multitude of ways. Don't be fearful of it. Take advantage of it. So that's the decade ahead. The third part of the book, Ray talks to what the next 50 years looks like. There's a section about the 5 great migrations: a migration into space, a migration into the virtual world, a migration, climate migration, migration into what I call the meta intelligence. And you and I have had some fun conversations on, what happens when you connect your brain to the cloud. So that's a quick overview on the book.
In terms of this technology accelerating, and sort of in terms of conversations Juliana and I have had, and maybe she can clarify this better, but this concept of having more time, and not just being more busy, but having more time. I don't know, Juliana, you might say, like, the idea that a woman normally, because of the biological fecundity and the childbearing years, a woman essentially has 30-something years to do what a man has 50-something years for in your traditional career. And so
Agreed.
that biological reproductive prime is in the middle. And we talk about this in the context of health span in our book in terms of food and diet. But in terms of the social organization and the social structure, she just had to take a 10-year period of her life for having children and being part of that. And then what you end up with is the careers move beyond you. So your children all gone to daycare the whole time, or, you're in there involved in their lives. And what happens is that part of the career, but being able to get there to career faster because of these accelerating technologies, and being able to actually be part of your career longer when your children start to get in their teens and stuff, and they're no longer interested in mom and dad things at the moment, they go into the tunnel. I mean, that's really something that can help in those kinds of situations as well.
Well, it's fascinating that things are evolving in that light. And what's kind of really fascinating is right now we've got this little microcosm where we're all being forced to stop, stay indoors, and rethink about all of this. So everything you're saying here is, being exponentiated right now. Like, we're seeing our collective mind aggregating and all these solutions coming and treatments coming and all this stuff in light of what's happening. And it's kind of interesting just to watch it right now in the last week. What's happened in this week is demonstrably true with what you're talking about throughout the book.
Yeah, the current pandemic crisis is accelerating a lot of the ideas outlined in the book. I just participated in a VR conference that had about 30,000 people plugged into it from around the world. I was one of the keynote speakers, and I was on stage in China, but I was in my living room in Santa Monica.
Wow.
It was done by VR, filming in VR and watching it in VR, and it was pretty extraordinary. Another thing that's interesting, Juliana, that you mentioned, and Ray, that you and I have talked about, is there really has never been a global unifying enemy.
Right. It's the first time. It's unprecedented.
Yeah, it really is.
Especially with our ability to communicate right now and all of these things that you're talking about. Like, all of that has never happened, first of all, and then we haven't had this global enemy, and here we are together. It's quite extraordinary to watch this unfold. It's just
it is
mind-blowing.
And we can all, and science, the T-shirt I'm wearing right now it says, let's have a moment of science. To the moment of
I
silence.
love that. Oh, we need one of those.
Yeah. And it's true because, not even the environment's been a global unifying threat, because some countries want global warming. It would help their economies in many ways if they have frozen tundra. And it almost became the unifying threat, but every country wants to solve a viral epidemic. And science, we're seeing everybody publishing. It's a global race to solve this.
Yes.
So it's pretty extraordinary.
And it's a really great first collective test. I mean, I would suggest that we used to use international space exploration as a unifying theme, but it wasn't people used to say that. It's not, people don't get together a lot of times for what they're for. They get together for what they're against, a lot of times. And that's an unfortunate part.
The pro-space movement doesn't work. The anti-abortion or anti-war movement, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we would say, this was evidence of why we really said, we didn't believe that any aliens that had come here that we had actually made contact with, because it would instantly galvanize funding for NASA and everybody else. But isn't it interesting that this alien sort of life form, because is it alive or is it not, ends up being this alien life form that we can galvanize and get behind, that regulatory things can get put out of the way. How many times did you say in a mature bureaucracy there's a rule against everything, right?
Everything, yes, yeah.
And if you guys are out there, if you Google Peter's Laws, this is something we spent time on together back in the day, and I still have my Peter's Laws poster here. But
love it.
But the idea here is that we really are seeing this, and I just believe that when this is over, if something transformative happens, that we don't go back to the sort of stovepipe, siloed thought process that we had before. This could be actually one of the best positive transformative events that we've had in science.
Yeah. It's crazy and insane and amazing.
And it's hard to say that because I don't want to sort of diminish people who lose loved ones or the real threats or some of the fears people have. What I'm saying is that it seems like we see in real time some of the things you've described in your book happening, and we're just clearing away artificial barriers. And isn't that really why it took us 11 years to do those things? I mean, how many barriers were real barriers?
It's really a... Go ahead, Peter.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say that it's really positive. I know so many people are out there really panicking and anxious and nervous. And this is, like I said, a microcosm view of what you summarize in your book and all the stuff that you guys have been doing for decades. It's really empowering and it's really it's optimistic. And I think it's a wonderful way to think about things, that this is all good. And there are so many positive things that can come out of all of this.
There is, and I want to remind people that despite fear, and the pandemic we have is a pandemic of fear right now, I believe we're living during the most extraordinary time ever in human history. We're living in a time where scientists around the world can bring to bear artificial intelligence and CRISPR technologies and gene therapies and to solve problems, and that we can communicate at the speed of light for free globally. And so I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, it's the opposite. It's a nice, refreshing flavor versus what you hear on the news everywhere and how people get sucked into all the negativity. There are so many good things that are happening.
Amen. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So in this, let's sort of segue a little bit to longevity. I guess that's another place where we intersect, our lives intersect, was at the founding of Singularity University. Maybe say a little bit about what Singularity University is, and then let's discuss what's happened in the last decade, because it was just 10 years ago that I came out for the founding of a Singularity University. Now I was rebooting my life as Ray 3.0. And this crazy cold stuff that I was doing that was just a crazy, Ray, tell the story, turned into actually something. So talk a little bit about Singularity University, and let's pull this into longevity. Because obviously a lot of our listeners will love hearing all of the exciting things that are going on in longevity.
Yeah, happily. So I remember when I was in medical school, watching a TV show on long-lived sea life, that species of turtles, whales, sharks could live multi-hundred-year lifespans. And I was like, well, if they can, why can't we? And I remember thinking to myself, it's either a hardware problem or software problem, and we're going to be able to fix that. And I think that is true. And so I set a ridiculous lifespan goal for myself.
700 years.
700 years, you remember?
Wow.
And think no small thoughts.
Yeah.
And you know, it's ridiculous because if you can, you know, I think if you can live 150 years right now, you could live forever. And the reason is that we're constantly intercepting new science, and we're going to be, you know, coming up with new ways to do this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing. And we're understanding why we age. We understand the biology of the human being. We humans were never designed to live past reproductive age. And the numbers are pretty clear. You would go into puberty age 13. And by the time you were in puberty, you were pregnant. There was no birth control. You were pregnant at age 14. And by the time you're 28, your baby is having a baby. And back 100,000 years ago, the only thing that mattered was the perpetuation of the species. And before there was Whole Foods and McDonald's, when food was scarce, the last thing you wanted to do was have the grandparents sticking around to take food out of the grandchildren's mouths. So what would happen is basically the best thing was for you to die and give your bits back to the environment. And that's what happened.
Yeah, we have that model in our book, 0 to 15 reproductive age, 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime, and then another 15 years to raise your youngest offspring. And at that point, 45 or 50, pretty much evolution's done with you. So, if there's any Paleolithic or any natural diet, it's really stops when you stop passing on your genes. And so what I'm struggling with, what you're struggling with, what Juliana's going to be struggling with soon, is this idea that we want to maximize those that right now until we can extend them. We want those healthy years that are after that reproductive prime, after that sort of evolutionary mandate is done. We want to live as healthy, as fully functional as we possibly can. And so it's really HealthSpan that the two of us are working on right now on diet, but ultimately it really comes back to longevity. But you've laid out there a pretty good solid foundation that says, hey, back to a hardware problem, we don't really need much after 45 or 50.
Correct.
And certainly we didn't evolve the ability to cope with excess because that wasn't an evolutionary selective pressure. We didn't have time. We have maybe some times of excess, but excess wasn't what we dealt with. We've dealt with that in the last 100 years with the advent of refrigeration, transportation, and agriculture prowess. Now we have abundance, and there's no downside to appetite in a calorie-scarce world. It's not that people that are overweight are broken, and we say all the time, you're not broken. This is exactly what we should expect. You do have an appetite. What's not natural is not having an appetite, because those people probably didn't jump in the gene pool with the same gusto as our real ancestors that ate whenever they had food, because it wasn't around. It was limited. So access, not excess, is what probably drove a lot of what you're talking about in terms of that evolutionary norm.
100%. 100%. So we end up in a scenario where we weren't designed to live old. In fact, it was a disadvantage because you take food away from your children and grandchildren. And so our Darwinian evolution is going to have to shift. And we're going to go from evolution by natural selection, which is Darwinism, to evolution by human direction. And that's about us taking over our own evolution of ourselves. And part of that is living older, and living older by doing a number of different things. And so in the book, I have a chapter on evolution, and it is a look at, or not evolution, on longevity. And it's a look at the fact that I think of it in a couple different ways. Number one, it's don't die from something stupid. So most of us,
I laugh when I hear you say that.
yeah, most of us have no idea what's going on inside our bodies. I go and I speak to audiences around the world and I say, hey, how many people here are absolutely sure there's nothing going on inside your body that you should be worried about? And of course, no one does. And it's insane. And what happens is, people croak, die overnight, or you hear of your friends who just found out they had stage 4 XYZ cancer, and it didn't happen instantly. It's been going on for some time. You just don't know about it. And I'm a pilot, and I drive a Tesla, and both of those vehicles are filled with sensors and computers. And I don't take off or drive out of the driveway unless all the systems are working well. And for most of us, our refrigerators are better wired than we are. And so how do we learn more about ourselves? And this is going to be wearables, implantables, Alexa in your house, all of these things. Right now, one of the companies I co-founded is a company called Human Longevity, HLI, that you go for a half a day and you get your full genome sequenced, your microbiome. We do a full body MRI, a brain MRI, a brain vasculature, a coronary CT, a lung CT. It is a 150 gigabytes of data about you. And that data is then analyzed to say, is there anything going on inside of you that you should be worried about? So I go every year. Guys, you should go too. The price tag used to be $25K. It's down to, I think, $7,500. I'm happy to offer everybody listening a 20% off discount on that.
Where do you do that?
It's in, the main location is San Diego, but there's now a facility in Naples and in LA and in San Francisco. It's called the Health Nucleus. And if anybody's interested, if you just email VIP@healthnucleus.com, VIP@healthnucleus.com, and just say, I'm a friend of Peter's and I'm interested in going, they'll respond to you. You get 20% off the price there. But it is, and the value of it, honestly, is worth way more. The company is just breaking even now on that. And the price, the margins on this will continue to grow over time, but it's a break-even testing for us right now. But the company has saved numerous lives of people who had no idea they had an aneurysm or a cancer or a significant genetic aberration that was going to impact them or their kids, because we're flying blind. So the first part of longevity is that, I go every year. I just went about a month ago, and I get I'm happy, everything's fine. But eventually I'll find something and I'll holy shit, I got to take care of that right away. And people say, I don't want to know. And I think that's bullshit. Of course you want to know and you want to solve it.
I was sitting here thinking, I don't want to know.
Yeah. No, but you can't. There's so many things that can be solved right now. The last thing I want to do is wait till the end. You're eventually going to know.
Right.
And you better know at the beginning.
I agree.
Where you can.
I'm being emotional.
Yeah. So,
there's a direct translation here between that and diet. I mean, everyone knows certain foods and certain things. They say, okay, no matter where you come from on the diet spectrum, there's these things that, okay, I shouldn't be eating this way. And yet we continue to do it. At some point in my life, I just made a decision, I don't need another cheeseburger. I've had enough of them in life. I mean, they were great. It was great. I just don't need those anymore because there's so many other amazing foods that I can eat now. And having struggled all the way up to 250, you remember me at my highest. I felt awful. And then rapidly, just losing that and having all those other life changes that happened a decade ago, I just felt so much better. And so, this rationalization you're talking about, that I just don't need, not now, not now, not now. And we turn not now with our clients, we turn not now into a food. It's like, we're not telling you don't eat this ever again. We're just saying right now, don't do it, until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable. You don't have a choice. One or more of those will dominate your plate. And the only way to create those new habits is to do them. This is what we have to do. And so this is a sort of a similar and overlapping concept, that making a change in diet that can potentially help on, or will help on health span, and knowing these things that we can know about our bodies now, those things go hand in hand.
For sure. The chapter goes on, and I have another book in development right now with Tony Robbins called Life Force, that is going to be looking at all of the technologies that are in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial to extend the healthy health span, as you said, of people. There's amazing stuff going on. So a lot of work going on in cellular medicine, stem cells in particular. How do you revitalize? So if you look at stem cells as a function of age, when you're born, your body has got massive numbers of stem cells circulating through you. And those stem cells go to any damaged tissue and they repair it. But if you look at the curve of stem cells versus age, it drops off precipitously after 30. And the body wasn't designed to continue to repair itself and to survive. It just didn't have a purpose or a function. So one of the reasons that we age and die is stem cell exhaustion. And so some of the therapies are, can you revitalize, can you replenish your stem cell population? Another area is senile cells. So there's something called, as you know, Ray, the Hayflick limit, that cells were designed to replicate up to 50 times and then are supposed to die. If they don't die, two things happen. Either they become a cancer and they keep growing, they keep replicating out of control. That's not good. Or the other thing is they just sit there and become zombie cells, or what are called senile cells. And these senile cells are generating basically inflammatory factors that just wreak havoc. And so there's a whole area of work going on right now that is focused on basically killing senile cells, getting rid of them so that you make room to grow new cells. Are you familiar then with the work of David Sinclair and NAD and NMN?
Yeah, I published a couple of papers with him.
You did?
Yes, you know that.
Oh man!
No, that's what happened out of the mild cold stress stuff that you started off there. In fact, it actually has a weird twist with Tony Robbins too, because this is really a crazy story. So I'm standing in line at TEDMed, which Mark Hodosh, our friend who started TEDMed, had invited me down that weekend when it was you and me and Mark and Elon Musk and Segway.
Dean Kamen.
Dean Kamen. Remember, we were all sitting there talking about energy, and I was talking about my building analogy, and Elon said that's why electric cars work, and Dean Kamen said that's also why Segway works, right? Remember that conversation we had about the cold weight loss? So they had all come to, this was the amount of cookies it took to go 10 stories, right? We all came up with this separately, this debate. We were all sitting there that time. And so anyway, because of that, Mark Hodosh was there at that time, and he and Dean came a little later and said, "Hey, Ray, we'd really like to have you as our guest down at TEDMed." So I went in 2009. And then in 2010, Tony Robbins came to speak, and he was there when I did my talk. And he came up afterwards and just centered me and said, "I really want to raise your game." And, he did that big smile and those hands, and he towered
Yes,
over me.
I know.
And I was cornered by Quincy Jones. This only happens, like, this sounds like a complete cartoon fantasy, but you remember how these early TEDs and TED Meds were. So I'm cornered by Quincy Jones because he wanted to lose weight. Tony Robbins comes up and tells me he's going to change my life. And he gives me a card, tells me this, if you need something. And so fast forward about a year or so later, life was just stressful. And I reached out to him, and he brought me out to one of his events. And so I'm sitting there at this event, and it turned out to be...
Was it a UPW or David?
Yeah, it was a UPW. And it turned out to be, I was a guest along with Oprah. And so she was there doing she was doing something with him. I think she did a documentary or did a coverage of this thing. But I was there, and he came down, because I was sitting in a section where he put us up sort of in the front. And he came down, and he just looked me straight in the eye. And he said, no one's coming. No one's going to solve this. You're going to have to solve this. And he's looking straight at me. He didn't call me out. I mean, he didn't, but he was just in my face. And then the other thing he says, you got to have resources, or you got to be resourceful. And, I didn't have a PhD. I didn't have an MD. I didn't have a huge bank account. But I was doing this stuff with cold. And meanwhile, at that TED Med that I went to, in the line, the very first day was this guy who was talking about cold stress. He asked me what I was doing. His badge really didn't say who he was. I told him, he immediately lit up, and he's talking all about it. He goes, oh, you got to look into this. And it turned out that guy was David Sinclair. He got on and we both got interrupted because, once again, Steve Wozniak came and cut lines with both of us, and we were both starstruck. We talked about this when he was on the podcast. We were starstruck by Steve Wozniak, and then we didn't get each other's contacts, but we reconnected, and he said, Ray, I really want you to look into this. This is way more than weight loss. You need to look at this as a cellular. This is really great longevity stuff. So after that Tony Robbins weekend, I went home, and I wrote an email to him and what was my daughter's pediatric endocrinologist, Andrew Bremer, who's now at NIH and was sort of the lead on type 2 diabetes before he took over the pediatric nutrition division. But I wrote an email to both of them and said, I had really looked at it, and I said, I want to write a paper. And so the metabolic winter hypothesis, that paper, that came from that confluence of events that all happened that how in the world. And it turned out to become the number one downloaded paper that year of those journals, of all of their 60 journals, not just of the journal we were in. And it's continued to be phenomenal. So we wrote that, and then a few years later, we wrote Oxidative Priority together. And then obviously Juliana and I did a follow-up on using both of that, where we came up with our concept of the food triangle that I've shared with you. And so what's really interesting is that back then, you and I knew who David was, but I was just blown away that, this amazing researcher from Harvard would collaborate. And he was right. He didn't care that I didn't have a PhD. He didn't care that I have an MD.
He is the sweetest guy on the planet.
He's phenomenal. He's so amazing. And he's so encouraging. Even when our book was coming out right after his, he was so supportive of what we were doing, and he pretty much sees that what we see. There's really only a couple ways you can sort this. If you drop the concepts of protein, carbs, and fat, which we preach, and you forget that for a second, and you look at how food is generally segregated, animal versus plant food, it just turns out all the advantageous things end up being over there in the plant pile. And everybody comes up with all these crazy stories, lectins and other things and anti-nutrients and stuff. And I'm not saying that there aren't some things, but most of that stuff, eating more fruits and vegetables is not going to kill people. This glucophobia is crazy. But the idea here, and what's, bringing this full circle back to what you were saying, is that David, he really pushed this idea, and it was really Anthony Robbins who said, straight to my face in front of 1,000 people, I wasn't on the stage.
The only way he can do it.
He does it. And when he does it, he pierces through you. It's like, and he remembered what my two little issues were, even in
Yes.
front of 1,000 people, and he just looked, and it just went right through me.
He is a blessing on this planet. I love that man
It's
so much.
unbelievable, and anybody sees him as this motivational speaker just doesn't understand where he's coming from. And
Yeah.
so anyway, David really has continued to propel. We've got another paper that we've been working on diabetes that we're both all delinquent on. All of us got busy, but we were going to get it out. But coming back to this and bringing about the longevity is that all of these things are converging on a few little things. I mean, when you look at our health span habits in there, eat a little bit of mild cold stress. I mean, it has good, contrast therapy has good. So, in what you guys are doing, along with these now sirtuin activating compounds and, sort of the fuel for the sirtuin activating compounds, this stuff all matters. It really does.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to live forever eating carrots. And we say that's the first line of our book. It's not true. And we aren't saying that. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm willing to bet that we're a lot closer with what we're doing than people that are just focused on, for example, ketosis. I think that's going to end up being like a little bit like obesity. Not that has no relationship or that it's unimportant, but I think it's something that comes along with a certain level of evolutionary adaptation. It's survival in times of scarcity so you can reproduce later. And I just believe that so many people achieve that nutritional ketosis with an excess of amino acids in their diet, and those all signal fecundity. We've not made organisms live longer by giving them that extra. So anyway, that's my sidetrack on that. But it's incredible how many of these people we've been fortunate enough to cross paths with, but it's also incredible that the future, it really is better than what we thought it was going to be.
Yep, it is. I mean, I feel like things are just hit the knee of the curve and are about to explode into the scene in the world in an amazing way. There's never been a better time to be alive. I have two boys that are 8.5 going on 9.
Wow.
And I want to be here for the next 50 years to see them. But I also want to be here for the next 150 years to see what's going to unfold as we evolve ourselves into the next level. And so there's, here's the notion. There's a bunch of things going on. There's WIT pathway manipulations from companies like SamuMed. There's obviously the work of the sirtuin system and David's work on the information theory of aging.
Yes, I
and
think
how
it's
do we
phenomenal.
reverse that? It's beautiful. And here's the goal. I think this decade, all of these things that you guys have been working on, that I'm working on and writing about as well, all of these things I think can get us an extra at least 10 healthy years. And guess what? Science doesn't sit still during those 10 additional years we have. We are growing the base of knowledge exponentially. And so in that 10 years, we're uncovering all these other discoveries. And we are, I believe, the concept that Ray Kurzweil has spoken about, and just blanked on his name, with the crazy ass beard.
Aubrey de Grey.
Aubrey de Grey. Thank you. Aubrey talks about is this idea of longevity escape velocity, that there's going to be a point in time that for every year you are alive, science is extending your life for more than a year. And so when will that be, and how will we hit that? Well, we're going to find out. And so, I think, listen, the basics, as you well know, sleep, exercise, diet, mindset, fundamental, critical, got to get those down. And then on top of that, then there's breakthroughs coming out of the biotech world.
Yeah. It is an exciting time to be alive, and you don't want to be the last person that dies from cancer.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the last person that dies from heart disease, and it's crazy, but it's probably not any crazier than us talking about rockets, private rockets landing vertically. when we were doing it in the 90s, early 90s, late 80s, I should say. Or really mid 80s, really. We started around 84, 85, didn't we? So
Yeah.
it's not crazy for us to think that that last heart attack person is probably already alive.
No, for sure. And it's not crazy to believe that we're going to make 100 years old and you 60, and then 120, and then we're going to start to understand how to go beyond that.
Right. Have you also had the experience that when you hit this age, because I'm 55 now, I didn't think 55 felt like this. I'm surprised that it doesn't feel older than it really does. Do you have that experience?
I feel like I'm 28. I feel young. I feel vibrant. I feel like, it feels not. I don't feel old, and I want to retain that level of energy. I'm doing more shit now, in my little pinky than I ever did, ever before. It's crazy, and it's compounding. I've got more energy than my entire team in their 20s. So I don't know. Things are pretty good.
So, Juliana, do you have anything left for Dr. Diamandis?
I mean, I have a lot of questions.
Well, ask one. Ask away.
We
can be old brothers and just talk forever on this stuff. So you go for it.
Well, I know you have a time limit. So just what would you recommend to anyone besides reading your books and everything and get all that inspiration and watching what you're doing? But, from what you've learned and what you've predicted, I mean, you guys are really kind of amazing. You both are such pioneers. I'm just sitting here listening and taking it all in. I've heard stories from Ray about you guys for, since I've known him, and wow, you guys are amazing. So I'm just, with all of that foresight and all of what you've seen kind of come to fruition and actually probably more and faster, what would you say going forward? Where should we keep our eyes on?
I think the most important thing is education. People doing two things. One, do you know what you want to do in the world? I mean, I don't care if you're 10 years old or you're 60 years old or 80 years old. Have you found a purpose? Do you know what you're here on this planet to do? Because that level of passion and commitment and what I call your massively transformative purpose, that is what wakes you up in the morning, keeps you going at night. When you're like, I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to create that rocket. I'm going to go and explore that area. That mindset element, so fundamentally critical, right? And so that is important to understand. How do you get that mindset? One of the things I created, I'll just mention it, something called Abundance Digital. If you go to abundance.digital, I've created an entire program, year-long program for entrepreneurs to help them find their massively transformative purpose, to inspire them, to help them connect with each other. And I think that if I had to trade anything, I would never trade my mindset. That's like the most fundamental thing. The second thing is, how do you educate yourself? How do you keep on top of it and be really constantly in a mindset of learning? I spend 80% of my day learning, and then other 20% out synthesizing and outputting. And Ray, I know you both do the same as well. So I mean, Abundance Digital is also does that. But it's, Ray, you'll love this. I created a 2-year-long project that we just did a beta release of. I've been so negative about the news media being fear-mongering.
Right.
Yes.
And I ended up creating a platform. It's a machine learning AI platform that scours the world's science journals, news media, social, and it searches for news which has got a positive and future forward sentiment that has that is about exponential technologies and convergence of exponential technologies as they apply to different industries. Anyway, long story short, we were in beta and we launched this week a version of it focused on the coronavirus and the pandemic. So every day I get an email synthesis of all of the solutions related. So how is AI and big data being used? How are robots and drones being used? How is CRISPR and gene therapies being used? Where's the the funding going? What are the companies that are thriving? How is augmented virtual reality being used to teach and for remote work? And I love it, and it's a way of getting the positive news out there to the world. So it's free for everybody. If people just go to futureloop.com/C19, you can just sign up and get this, and just to get a flood of positive mindset news and educate yourself. So those are the things that I think about. It's motivation and mindset and learning.
Yeah, and this is so important because one of the things that you hit me between the eyes with your book that you don't know about is when I looked at those 7 forces, and real quickly, we didn't list them, but time abundance, capital abundance, democratization of technology, increased genius, communication abundance, new business models, and increased longevity. And in an earlier version, I think at one point you had computational abundance in there. I think it got dropped for business, but time abundance. So here's what's interesting that I know about myself, and this is something I even talked to Juliana about today. The downside of rebooting in the middle of your life is that things that you could easily get done when there were a ton of resources. This gets back to Tony Robbins, resourcefulness. Resources or resourcefulness. We were trying our best in our day to be resourceful, and we had all these contacts, and we were utilizing that to create board of directors, to create advisory boards, to create momentum, right? So one of the things that rebooting in the middle of your life the way I did, Ray 3.0, and in a totally different field, which I don't, I'm not necessarily have what would be the typical requisite education, but even that is now changing because I think solutions are more important than certifications. But what's really interesting here is that time abundance is something I think I took for granted. And that is that I spend too much of my day now solving problems that I really don't need to be solved, and trying to flip that, because I need to flip that part of it, because there is so many resources in abundance and so many different options. And sometimes we work hard on one option instead of just dropping it and moving on to something else. So, it's a real practical thing that came out of your book that made me aware, and I think that going along with what you're saying about the media, so many people waste so much of their time watching the news. I mean, they just waste their time. Complete waste of time.
The media is just, it's the crisis news network, and it's like, what are these editors and these programmers want to stick in your brain? Please they couldn't pay me enough money.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's a mess.
Thank you so much, Ray. I love you, pal, and I'm always thankful to spend time with you, and need to see you in person soon.
Right. It's great having you on.
Yeah,
thank you so much for
so
making the time.
Peter. Thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you. Same here.
Take care.
All right, big hug.
So inspiring. Absolutely fascinating.
The future is faster than you think.
Thank you for joining us on this leafy green path to good health.
It's always the food, so remember, keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucery. For more details about the content in today's show, or to contact Juliana and Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.